Hope you enjoy being homeless because I made sure you get nothing." My father said it loud enough for everyone in the courtroom to hear. A few people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Others smiled. One man near the back actually chuckled. The words hung in the air like cigarette smoke. Heavy. Ugly. Impossible to ignore. I stared at my father across the courtroom. William Morgan, 68 years old, owner of a successful construction company in Columbus, Ohio, a respected businessman, a church donor, a man people described as honorable, a man who had spent most of my life treating me like I was a mistake. And at that moment he looked proud. Not angry, not emotional, proud. As though humiliating his own daughter in public was some kind of achievement. Then I laughed. Not a nervous laugh, not a bitter laugh. A genuine laugh. The kind that escaped before I could stop it. My father's smile vanished. "What's so funny?" he snapped. Before I could answer, the judge looked up from the documents in front of him. His eyes settled on me. For a moment he looked confused, then curious, then strangely familiar. "Wait," he said. The entire courtroom became silent. He leaned forward. "You're the girl who—" And suddenly every person in that room was staring at me. But to explain what happened next, I need to tell you how I got there. Because that courtroom battle didn't begin that morning. It started more than 20 years earlier, back when I was a little girl trying desperately to earn my father's love. My name is Rachel Morgan. I'm 34 years old. And for most of my life, I believed there was something wrong with me. I grew up in a modest neighborhood outside Columbus. My father built houses. My mother stayed home. My older brother, Michael, was 6 years ahead of me. From the outside, we looked like the perfect American family. Inside the house, things felt different. Michael was my father's pride. I was simply there. I noticed it before I was 10 years old. If Michael got a B on a test, Dad celebrated. If I got straight A's, Dad nodded and changed the subject. If Michael scored a touchdown, Dad invited the whole family out for dinner. If I won an academic award, he usually forgot to attend the ceremony. At first, I thought I just needed to try harder. Children always assume they can earn love. So I tried. God knows I tried. I worked harder in school, helped around the house, avoided trouble, made honor roll every year. Nothing changed. One evening when I was about 13, I finally asked my mother, "Dad doesn't like me much, does he?" She looked heartbroken. For a second, I thought she might tell me the truth. Instead, she smiled weakly. "Of course he loves you." I remember staring at my plate. "That's not what I asked." She never answered. That silence followed me for years. Michael didn't help. As we got older, he became increasingly like our father. Confident, entitled, certain the world revolved around him. Dad gave him opportunities I never received. A summer job at the company, a company truck, business mentoring, networking introductions. When Michael graduated college, Dad handed him a management position. No interview, no competition. Just handed it over. I worked my way through nursing school with scholarships and part-time jobs. Dad barely noticed. Then September 11th happened. Like millions of Americans, I watched the towers fall. Something changed inside me. I wanted my life to matter. I wanted to serve something bigger than myself. A year later, I joined the Army. The conversation with my father remains one of the clearest memories of my life. We sat at the kitchen table. I was 20 years old, nervous but excited. "Dad, I enlisted." He stared at me. "What?" "The Army." For several seconds, he said nothing. Then he laughed. Not because he thought I was joking, because he thought I was stupid. "The Army." I nodded. "I want to serve." His face hardened. "You want to throw your life away." "I don't see it that way." "Of course you don't." That was the beginning of our longest argument. He told me I was making a mistake. I told him I had made my decision. He accused me of abandoning the family. I reminded him Michael already had the company. Eventually he stood up. "You'll regret this." I never forgot those words. Because I never did regret it. Not once. Military life wasn't easy. There were deployments, long nights, dangerous situations, friends who didn't come home. But for the first time in my life, I belonged somewhere. Nobody cared whose daughter I was. Nobody cared who my father favored. The Army measured performance, character, discipline, trust, things I could actually control. Over time, I became a combat medic, then an officer. I built a career. Built friendships, built a purpose. Meanwhile, my relationship with my father grew colder. Phone calls became rare. Visits became shorter. Every holiday felt like walking into a room where I wasn't wanted. Still, I kept trying. Because no matter how old we get, part of us remains that child waiting for a parent to finally say, "I'm proud of you." The words never came. Years passed. Then my grandfather died. Grandpa Henry was different from my father. Kind, patient, fair. He treated Michael and me equally. When I visited, he asked about my deployments, my patience, my life. He listened. Actually listened. After he passed away, I was devastated. The funeral was difficult, but what happened afterward proved even worse. A few months later, my father informed me there would be an estate hearing. Nothing unusual. Families handle inheritances every day. I wasn't expecting much. Honestly, I didn't care much about the money. I attended out of respect for my grandfather. Then I arrived at the courthouse. The atmosphere felt strange immediately. Michael looked smug. My father looked confident. My mother looked nervous. The attorneys exchanged paperwork. The hearing began. One document after another was reviewed. Then came the announcement. Michael would receive nearly everything. The company shares, the investment accounts, the properties, the savings, everything. I received nothing. Not a dollar, not a keepsake, not even my grandfather's old watch. Nothing. For a moment I simply sat there, trying to process what I'd heard. Then my father leaned toward me. A smile spread across his face. The smile of a man finally delivering a punishment he'd waited years to give. And that's when he said it. "Hope you enjoy being homeless, because I made sure you get nothing." The room became silent. I looked at him. Then I laughed. Not because it was funny, because suddenly something felt very wrong indeed. And judging by the expression forming on the judge's face, I wasn't the only one who sensed it. The courtroom remained quiet after my father's remark. I could feel dozens of eyes moving between us. Some people looked embarrassed for me. Others looked curious. Most seemed to assume they were witnessing a simple inheritance dispute. A bitter daughter. A disappointed father. Nothing unusual. The judge, however, wasn't looking at my father anymore. He was looking directly at me. His eyes narrowed, not with suspicion, with recognition. The kind of expression someone gets when they're trying to remember where they've seen a face before. He glanced down at the paperwork, then back at me, then down again. The room felt strangely still. Even my father seemed unsettled. "Your Honor," his attorney finally asked. The judge didn't answer immediately. Instead, he adjusted his glasses. "Miss Morgan," he said slowly. "Have we met before?" I blinked. "No, sir." His forehead wrinkled. "That's odd." He studied me another moment. Then he shook his head and returned his attention to the documents. The hearing resumed. But something had changed. I could feel it. The judge wasn't paying attention the same way he had before. Every few minutes he'd glance toward me again, as though trying to solve a puzzle. Meanwhile, my father sat confidently beside Michael. Neither of them noticed. Or perhaps they simply didn't care. They believed they had already won. And maybe they would have, if life hadn't taken a very unexpected turn several years earlier. A turn my family knew almost nothing about, because they never asked. Most of my military career was invisible to them. They knew I served. They knew I deployed. That was about it. Whenever I visited home, conversations rarely lasted more than a few minutes. Dad would ask when I planned to leave the Army. Michael would talk about the company. Mom would try to keep everyone polite. Then we'd all go home. No one ever asked what I had experienced overseas. No one ever asked what I had seen, or who I had become. Perhaps that's why they never learned about Afghanistan. 5 years earlier, I was serving as a combat medic attached to an Army unit operating near Kandahar. It wasn't my first deployment, but it was the hardest. The region was dangerous. Roadside bombs, rocket attacks, constant uncertainty. Every day required focus. The smallest mistake could get someone killed. By then I was a captain, experienced enough to stay calm under pressure, at least most of the time. The incident that changed everything happened on an unusually hot afternoon in July. I remember the heat more than anything. The air felt thick. The dust seemed to cover everything. We had just returned from a patrol when alarms sounded across the compound. At first, nobody understood what was happening. Then the explosion hit. The blast shook the ground beneath us. Windows shattered. Smoke filled the air. People started yelling. Training took over. Everyone moved automatically. Soldiers rushed toward defensive positions. Medics rushed toward the wounded. I ran toward the explosion. Not because I was brave, because that's what medics do. When everyone else runs away from danger, we run toward it. The damaged structure was partially collapsed. Fire spread rapidly through one section. Several soldiers had been trapped inside. The situation was chaotic. People shouted conflicting information. Nobody knew exactly how many were missing. I remember reaching the building entrance. A sergeant grabbed my arm. "Captain, it's too dangerous." I pulled free. "There are still people inside." Then I went in. The smoke was overwhelming. Visibility was terrible. The heat felt like opening an oven door directly into my face. Inside, everything was confusion. Broken concrete, twisted metal, falling debris. I located the first injured soldier near a collapsed wall. He was conscious but unable to walk. I dragged him outside, then went back in, again and again. Each trip became more dangerous. The fire continued spreading. Parts of the structure were becoming unstable. Someone outside shouted that the roof might collapse. They were probably right. But there were still voices inside. I could hear them. One belonged to a young lieutenant, barely 25 years old, pinned beneath debris, terrified. I managed to reach him during my fourth entry. The situation was bad. His leg was trapped. Smoke was thickening. The ceiling groaned above us. For a moment, I honestly thought we might both die there. But somehow we got him free. I don't remember much after that. Only fragments. The weight, the heat, the exhaustion, the sound of people yelling outside when we emerged. Then darkness. I woke up 2 days later. Concussion. Smoke inhalation. Minor injuries. Nothing life-threatening. The lieutenant survived. So did several others. In total, 6 soldiers were pulled from that building. The Army conducted an investigation. Statements were collected. Reports were written. Then life moved forward. At least for me. The military later awarded me a medal for the rescue. There was a ceremony, a few photographs, some media coverage. The usual things. I never thought much about it afterward. Most veterans don't. You do your job. You move on. Besides, countless service members had done far more heroic things than I ever would. What mattered to me was simple. People came home alive. That was enough. The strange part came months later. A letter arrived. Handwritten. Unexpected. Inside was a message from the father of the young lieutenant I had helped rescue. He thanked me for saving his son, said there were no words large enough to express his gratitude. The letter was deeply personal, heartfelt. I kept it in a drawer. Nothing more. Life continued. Another deployment. Another assignment. Another year. Eventually, I forgot about the letter altogether. And apparently my family never knew it existed. Not that they would have cared. Back in the courtroom, the hearing entered its second hour. The attorneys continued discussing assets, property valuations, account transfers, legal language that bored everyone except the lawyers. I noticed the judge becoming increasingly distracted. At one point, he removed his glasses entirely. He stared at me, not casually, intently. Then he opened a folder, flipped through several pages, stopped. His eyes widened. A strange feeling settled into my stomach. The judge suddenly looked as though he had found something important. Very important. Slowly he raised his head. The courtroom fell silent again. My father shifted in his chair. "What is it?" Michael whispered. Nobody answered. The judge continued staring at me. For several long seconds he said nothing. Then his expression changed completely. Recognition. Absolute recognition. As if a missing piece had finally fallen into place. He leaned forward. "Miss Morgan?" I nodded. "Yes, Your Honor." His voice sounded almost disbelieving. "Your full name is Rachel Ann Morgan." "Yes, sir." He sat back slowly. A look of astonishment crossed his face. Then he whispered words that made my heart skip. Words I never expected to hear in that courtroom. Dear God. The judge stared at me, and suddenly I realized he remembered exactly who I was. Dear God. The judge's voice barely rose above a whisper. Yet somehow everyone in the courtroom heard it. The room fell completely silent. No rustling papers, no whispered conversations, no movement. Just silence. I sat frozen in my chair. The judge stared at me as though he had just seen a ghost. My father looked irritated. Michael looked confused. The attorneys exchanged puzzled glances. Finally, the judge removed his glasses. "Miss Morgan," he said carefully. "Would you please stand?" I slowly rose to my feet. Every eye in the room followed me. For a moment, I wondered if I had somehow done something wrong. The judge continued studying me. Then he asked a question I never expected. "Were you serving near Kandahar 5 years ago?" My stomach tightened. "Yes, sir." A murmur moved through the courtroom. The judge nodded slowly. "And were you the Army captain who entered a burning operations building multiple times after an enemy attack?" The room became even quieter. I could actually hear the air conditioning system humming above us. I hesitated. Not because I was hiding anything. I simply hated talking about it. Yes, sir. The judge closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them again, they looked emotional. Very emotional. My father shifted uncomfortably. What does this have to do with anything? He asked. The judge ignored him. Instead, he continued looking at me. Captain Rachel Morgan. I hadn't heard anyone call me that in months. Not since leaving active service. The title sounded strange inside a probate courtroom. The judge nodded to himself. Then he turned toward the spectators, toward the attorneys, toward everyone. I cannot believe this. My father frowned. Your Honor. The judge finally looked at him. What happened next changed the entire atmosphere of the room. You really don't know who your daughter is, do you? The question hit my father like a slap. His face reddened immediately. What is that supposed to mean? The judge leaned back in his chair. For several seconds he said nothing. Then he looked directly at me. I owe this woman more than I can ever repay. The room exploded into whispers. My father looked stunned. Michael looked even worse. I felt my heart begin to pound. Because suddenly I knew exactly what was happening. The letter, the young lieutenant, the father. Oh my God. The judge wasn't just someone who had heard about the rescue. He was the father. The realization hit me all at once. The courtroom seemed to shrink around me. The judge slowly stood. Nobody interrupted him. Nobody dared. My son was serving in Afghanistan 5 years ago. His voice was steady, but emotion lingered beneath every word. He was trapped inside a building after an enemy attack. Several people in the courtroom leaned forward. The judge continued. The military informed us there had been casualties. His eyes drifted toward the floor. I still remember receiving that phone call. For the first time, he sounded less like a judge and more like a father. A father remembering one of the worst days of his life. My wife and I spent hours believing our son might be dead. The courtroom remained silent. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. We later learned he survived because a combat medic repeatedly entered a burning structure to rescue trapped soldiers. He looked at me, directly at me. That medic was Captain Rachel Morgan. A collective gasp swept across the room. I heard someone whisper, "Wow." Another person muttered, "No way." My father simply stared. The confident smile he'd worn all morning had vanished completely. The judge wasn't finished. Most people never hear about acts of courage like that. His gaze moved across the room. They happen every day among the men and women who serve this country. Then he looked back at my father. But occasionally one of those stories becomes very personal. His voice softened. My son came home because of her. Nobody spoke. I felt dozens of eyes fixed on me. The attention made me uncomfortable. It always had. I wished I could disappear. But the judge continued. Captain Morgan suffered injuries during the rescue. I quietly shook my head. They weren't serious. He smiled sadly. That's exactly what my son said you would say. A few people laughed softly. The tension broke for a moment. Then the judge reached into his briefcase. He opened a worn leather folder. From inside, he removed a folded piece of paper. I recognized it immediately. A copy of the letter. The one he had written years earlier. I keep this in my office. His voice grew quieter. I read it every Veterans Day. My throat tightened. I hadn't expected that. Not at all. The judge unfolded the paper. Then he read a few lines aloud. Not many. Just enough. Enough to understand. Enough to feel the weight behind the words. A father thanking the woman who saved his son. A family expressing gratitude that could never truly be repaid. When he finished, nobody spoke. Several people looked emotional. One elderly woman in the gallery wiped her eyes. Even one of the attorneys looked uncomfortable. The kind of uncomfortable that comes from realizing you've misjudged someone. The judge folded the letter carefully. Then he turned toward my father again. What surprises me most, he said, is that this appears to be news to her family. My father swallowed. For the first time all day, he looked unsure of himself. Michael finally spoke. You never told us. I looked at him. You never asked. The words came out gently. Not angry. Not bitter. Simply true. Michael looked away. My mother lowered her head. Tears had begun forming in her eyes. I wasn't sure whether they came from pride or guilt. Perhaps both. The judge slowly returned to his seat. But before sitting down, he said something that nobody in that room would ever forget, including me. He looked directly at my father. His expression was calm, controlled. Yet there was steel beneath it, the kind of steel that comes from conviction. You may not know who your daughter is, Mr. Morgan. The room held its breath. But I do. Silence. Absolute silence. My father had spent decades building a reputation, building authority. building status. Yet, in that moment, he looked smaller than I had ever seen him. Not because the judge humiliated him, because the truth had. For years, Dad had viewed me as the disappointing daughter. The daughter who abandoned the family business. The daughter who chose military service over his approval. The daughter who could never measure up to Michael. Now, strangers in the courtroom were looking at me with more respect than my father had shown in 20 years. And for the first time, I think he realized it. The judge glanced back down at the estate documents. His expression changed. The emotional moment was over. Now he was a judge again. Professional. Methodical. Sharp. He picked up one of the files. Flipped through several pages. Then stopped. His eyes narrowed. The room grew quiet once more. A different kind of quiet. Not emotional. Concerned. The judge examined a document. Then another. Then another. Slowly he looked toward my father's attorney. Counselor. The attorney straightened. Yes, Your Honor. The judge tapped the paperwork with one finger. His face had become unreadable. I have a question regarding these asset transfers. My father's expression changed instantly, and for the first time that day, I saw fear. Real fear. The fear appeared for only a second. Most people in the courtroom probably missed it. I didn't. When you've spent years in the military, you learn to notice tiny changes in people. A tightened jaw, a sudden shift in posture, a glance that lasts a fraction too long. Fear has a way of revealing itself, and my father was afraid. The judge held up a document. Counselor, can you explain this transfer? My father's attorney adjusted his glasses. Which transfer, Your Honor? The Riverside property. The attorney accepted the document. His confident expression faded almost immediately. I'll need a moment. The judge nodded. You have one. A strange tension settled over the room. The kind that appears when something unexpected enters the conversation. Something nobody planned for. My father sat perfectly still. Too still. Michael noticed it too. Dad? No response. Dad? My father finally looked at him. It's nothing. But it didn't sound like nothing. The judge continued reviewing paperwork. Several minutes passed. Then he located another document. His expression darkened further. Interesting. Nobody liked the sound of that word. Especially lawyers. The attorney cleared his throat. Your Honor, there may be a clerical explanation. Perhaps. The judge picked up another file. Then maybe you can explain this one as well. The attorney accepted it. Read it. Then frowned. I watched him carefully. Whatever he was seeing, he clearly hadn't expected it. That surprised me. Until that moment, I had assumed everyone involved knew exactly what was happening. Apparently they didn't. The judge leaned back. Let's take a brief recess. His gavel struck. People immediately began whispering. Attorneys gathered around tables. Spectators discussed the military story they'd just heard. The atmosphere felt completely different now. The inheritance hearing had transformed into something else. Something bigger. I remained seated. I wasn't interested in gossip. I simply wanted answers. A few moments later, my mother approached. She looked older than I remembered. Smaller somehow. Fragile. Rachel. I looked up. Hi, Mom. Her eyes filled with tears. I didn't know. I already knew what she meant. The rescue. She nodded. Why didn't you tell us? I offered a sad smile. When would I have told you? She opened her mouth, then closed it. Because she knew the answer. There hadn't been a moment. Not one. Over the years, our conversations had become polite exchanges about weather holidays and schedules. Nothing deeper. Nothing real. My mother sat beside me. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Finally, she whispered something that hurt more than I expected. I should have asked. I nodded. Yeah. She looked down at her hands. I should have asked a lot of things. Across the room, Michael was arguing quietly with our father. I couldn't hear the words, but I could read body language. Michael looked frustrated. Dad looked defensive. That alone felt unusual. For most of my life, Michael had followed Dad's lead without question. Now something had changed. The recess ended 15 minutes later. Everyone returned to their seats. The judge immediately resumed reviewing documents. No small talk, no delay. Straight to business. Before proceeding, he said, I have concerns regarding several transactions connected to this estate. The room became silent again. The attorney rose. We are prepared to address any concerns, Your Honor. Good. The judge held up a folder. Because I have many. A few people exchanged nervous glances. The judge began listing dates, property transfers, investment reallocations, changes to ownership records. Most sounded incredibly boring. until he reached one specific date, a date that made my mother's face go pale. The judge noticed. "So you recognize that date?" My mother hesitated. "Yes." "What is its significance?" She looked toward my father. For a moment I thought she might remain silent, just as she had remained silent so many times before. Then something unexpected happened. She answered. "That was the week my father was hospitalized." The room grew still. The judge nodded. "Your father being Henry Lawson?" "Yes." "My grandfather." The judge continued. "Medical records indicate he was heavily medicated during that period." My father's attorney stood quickly. "Objection. On what grounds?" The attorney hesitated. The judge waited. No answer came. Finally, the judge continued. "During that same period, multiple estate modifications were executed. The room seemed to shrink around us." I looked at my father. His face had become expressionless, but I could see the tension in his eyes. The judge wasn't accusing anyone yet. He was simply laying out facts. Yet those facts sounded increasingly troubling. Then came the moment that changed everything. The judge opened another folder. A thick one. He removed a handwritten document. "What is that?" Michael asked. Nobody answered. The judge examined the paper carefully. Then he spoke. "This appears to be an earlier version of Mr. Lawson's estate plan." My heartbeat quickened. "Earlier version?" The attorney looked confused. "I wasn't aware such a document existed." Apparently, neither were several other people. The judge began reading portions aloud. "Not everything. Just enough. Enough to establish a shocking fact. My grandfather's original estate plan had divided assets equally between Michael and me, 50-50. Exactly equally." The courtroom erupted. People whispered openly now. Even the attorneys looked stunned. I sat frozen, unable to process what I had heard. Equal. Grandpa had intended equal. All these years I had assumed he simply preferred Michael, just like Dad did. Apparently I had been wrong. Very wrong. My throat tightened. I suddenly remembered countless conversations with Grandpa. The way he'd always treated me fairly. The way he'd never compared me to Michael. The way he'd always listened. Of course he hadn't cut me out. He never would have. The realization hit like a punch to the chest. Across the room, Michael looked horrified. "Dad!" My father stared straight ahead. Not moving. Not speaking. Michael's voice shook. "Dad, what is this?" Still no answer. The judge folded the document, then looked directly at my father. "Mr. Morgan." "Nothing." "Mr. Morgan." Slowly, Dad raised his eyes. The judge's voice remained calm, but firm. "Can you explain why your father-in-law's original estate plan differs so dramatically from the final version?" Silence. A long silence. My father opened his mouth, then closed it again. For the first time in my life, William Morgan appeared completely unprepared. The man always had answers, always had explanations, always controlled the room. Not today. The judge continued. Perhaps more importantly, he lifted another document. "Can you explain why several transfers appear to benefit only one beneficiary?" Michael looked stunned. "Beneficiary." The judge turned a page. "Your son." The color drained from Michael's face, because suddenly he realized something. This wasn't simply about me being excluded. This wasn't just favoritism. This was something far more serious. If these documents were accurate, my father hadn't merely hurt me. He may have manipulated an entire estate. An estate belonging to a dying man who trusted him. And for the first time, Michael looked at Dad not with admiration, but with doubt. The judge closed the folder. His expression was grave. "I'm ordering a full review of these records." The room exploded into murmurs. My father finally spoke. "That's ridiculous." The judge's gaze hardened. "No, Mr. Morgan." He paused. "What's ridiculous is that these questions were never asked sooner." And suddenly I understood something. The inheritance hearing wasn't ending. It was just beginning. For most of my life, my father had been the strongest man in every room. Not physically, not emotionally, but socially, financially, professionally. People listened when William Morgan spoke. Bankers respected him. Business owners sought his advice. Church leaders praised his generosity. Neighbors admired his success. My father had spent decades building a reputation. And now, for the first time, I was watching cracks form in that foundation. The court-ordered review moved quickly, faster than I expected. The judge postponed further estate proceedings pending investigation. Within weeks, accountants began examining records, property transactions, bank statements, estate documents, tax filings, everything. I returned to my normal life. At least I tried to. I was no longer on active duty, having recently transitioned into civilian healthcare work at a veterans medical center outside Columbus. My days were filled with patients, men and women who had served. Many carried visible wounds, others carried invisible ones. Working with them helped keep me grounded. The courtroom drama felt distant, until the phone calls started. First came my mother, then my attorney, then Michael. Everyone wanted to talk. Everyone suddenly wanted answers. For years, nobody had shown much interest in my life. Now, my phone wouldn't stop ringing. The irony wasn't lost on me. One afternoon, my attorney called. "Rachel, I thought you'd want an update." I sat in my kitchen with a cup of coffee. "Good news or bad news?" A pause. "Depends on how you define good." That wasn't encouraging. What did they find? More than expected. I closed my eyes. Part of me already knew. The evidence was becoming difficult to ignore. Several transactions appeared questionable. Some occurred while my grandfather was heavily medicated. Others involved sudden ownership changes. A few signatures were being examined by forensic specialists. The words made my stomach turn. Not because I was surprised. Because I wasn't. Deep down, I think I had known for years that something wasn't right. I simply never wanted to believe my father could go that far. After the call ended, I sat quietly for a long time. I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt sad. Profoundly sad. Because every new discovery damaged not only my father, it damaged the entire family. A week later, the local newspaper published an article. Nothing dramatic. Just a brief report about an ongoing probate dispute involving a prominent businessman. No accusations. No conclusions. Just facts. Yet that was enough. In small communities, people notice things. Within days, rumors spread. Questions followed. Business associates became cautious. Clients grew nervous. People started talking. For the first time in decades, my father was no longer controlling the narrative. The truth was beginning to speak for itself. Then Michael showed up at my house. Unannounced. I nearly didn't recognize him. He looked exhausted. Older. Defeated. Nothing like the confident older brother I remembered. When I opened the door, he stood there awkwardly. "Can we talk?" I hesitated, then nodded. We sat at my kitchen table. The same table where I usually paid bills and sorted mail. Nothing fancy. Nothing impressive. Michael stared at his coffee. For nearly a minute. Finally he spoke. "Did you know what? That Grandpa wanted things divided equally." I shook my head. "No." His shoulders slumped. "I didn't either." For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he laughed bitterly. "I spent my entire life believing I earned everything." His words carried genuine pain. Not arrogance, pain. I thought Dad trusted me more. I looked at him carefully. The realization was hitting him hard. Because favoritism hurts everyone, including the favorite, especially the favorite. It creates impossible expectations, distorted relationships, false confidence. Michael was finally seeing that. "I never asked for this," he said quietly. "I know. I honestly thought Grandpa changed his mind." "I know." He looked at me. His eyes were red. "You hate me, don't you?" The question surprised me. I thought about it honestly. Years of resentment, years of unfair treatment, years of comparisons. Then I shook my head. "No." His expression softened slightly. "I probably would." I smiled sadly. "Maybe when I was younger." We sat in silence. For the first time in our lives, we weren't competing. We weren't arguing. We weren't playing roles assigned by our father. We were simply two people trying to understand what had happened to our family. Before leaving, Michael stopped at the door. "Rachel." "Yeah, I'm sorry." The words were simple, but sincere, and somehow that mattered. A lot. A few days later, my mother called. Her voice sounded fragile. "Would you come by?" I almost said no. Almost. Instead, I drove to the house where I grew up. The same house. The same front porch. The same maple tree in the yard. Everything looked familiar, yet somehow smaller. My mother greeted me at the door. The moment I saw her face, I knew something had changed. She looked exhausted. Emotionally exhausted. We sat in the living room, the room where decades of family history had unfolded. Birthdays, Christmas mornings, arguments, silences, all of it. My mother twisted a tissue in her hands. Then she finally said what she'd been carrying for years. I knew some things weren't right. I remained silent. I didn't know everything. Her voice cracked. But I knew enough. The words hurt. Not because they shocked me. Because they confirmed what I'd always suspected. "You could have said something." Tears rolled down her cheeks. "I know." You could have defended me. I know. You could have stopped some of it. She lowered her head. I know. The room fell silent. For years I had imagined this conversation, imagined yelling, imagined anger, imagined confrontation. Instead, all I felt was sadness. My mother wasn't evil. She wasn't cruel. She was weak. And weakness has consequences, sometimes devastating ones. Before I left, she hugged me. For a long time. Longer than she ever had when I was young. Neither of us said much. There wasn't much left to say. Weeks turned into months. The investigation continued. Evidence accumulated. Questions multiplied. Meanwhile, my father seemed to withdraw from the world. Friends stopped calling as often. Business lunches disappeared. Community invitations slowed. People who once praised him now avoided uncomfortable conversations. Success attracts company. Scandal creates distance. One evening I drove past his office building. The parking lot was nearly empty. The lights were off. For some reason, that image stayed with me. Not because I enjoyed it. Because I didn't. The man who had spent decades chasing status was discovering how fragile status really is. Money can disappear. Reputation can collapse. Power can fade. What remains is character. And character is much harder to build. A few days later, I received another call from my attorney. The review is almost complete. I stared out my apartment window. And a long pause. Then he said something I'll never forget. Rachel, I think your father is about to lose far more than this case. After the call ended, I sat alone in the gathering darkness, thinking, not about inheritance, not about money, not about revenge. I thought about family, about choices, about consequences. And somewhere across town for perhaps the first time in his life, William Morgan was sitting alone with his own. 3 weeks after my attorney told me the investigation was nearly complete, I received a phone call I never expected. It was my father. For a moment, I simply stared at the screen. William Morgan. I couldn't remember the last time he'd called me first. Usually communication happened through my mother. Or not at all. The phone rang 4 times before I answered. Hello. Silence. Then his voice. Older than I remembered. Tired. Rachel. I waited. I'd like to see you. No apology. No explanation. Just those words. I leaned back in my chair. Why? Another pause. Because there are things I should have said a long time ago. I almost laughed. Not because it was funny. Because after 20 years that statement felt absurd. There were thousands of things he should have said. Thousands. Instead, he had chosen silence. Criticism. Distance. I looked out the window. Rain tapped softly against the glass. I don't know if that's a good idea. I understand. His voice sounded defeated. Not angry. Not defensive. Defeated. Something about that unsettled me. My father had never sounded defeated before, not once. Finally, he spoke again. Please. One word. Quiet. Almost fragile. I closed my eyes. Part of me wanted to refuse. Part of me wanted to hang up. Part of me wanted to protect myself from whatever came next. But another part of me was tired. Tired of carrying old wounds. Tired of unanswered questions. Tired of wondering why. There's a Veterans Memorial Park near downtown. I knew the place. A peaceful park overlooking the river. Several monuments. Rows of engraved names. A place people visited to remember. To reflect. To grieve. Tomorrow morning. Okay, and that was it. The call ended. I barely slept that night. Not because I feared him. Because I feared disappointment. Again. The next morning was cool and overcast. The kind of Ohio morning that feels older than the calendar says. I arrived early. Old habits from military life. My father was already there, sitting on a bench near the memorial wall. For a moment I simply watched him. He looked smaller than I remembered. Not physically, spiritually. Like life had finally become heavier than he could carry. When I approached, he stood, awkwardly, almost nervously. I couldn't remember ever seeing him nervous. Thanks for coming. I nodded. Neither of us sat immediately. The silence stretched between us. 20 years of silence. Finally, I sat on the bench. He sat beside me, several feet away, like strangers. Maybe that's what we were. For a long time, neither of us spoke. The wind rustled nearby trees. A flag moved gently above the memorial. Eventually, my father broke the silence. I saw the investigation report. I waited. They found enough. His voice sounded hollow. The findings had been devastating. Several estate modifications had been ruled improper. Multiple transfers had been reversed. The final legal consequences were still being resolved. But the truth was no longer in doubt. I know. He stared at the memorial wall. I deserve most of what's happened. The admission surprised me. My father had spent his entire life avoiding responsibility, yet here he was, accepting it, at least partially. Still, I wasn't ready to make things easy. Most of it, he nodded slowly. Fair question. For several seconds, he gathered his thoughts. Then he surprised me again. I wasn't angry because you joined the army. I blinked. Of all the things I expected him to say, that wasn't one of them. What? I know that's what you believed. It is what you said. I know. His eyes remained fixed on the memorial.
But it wasn't the truth.
I folded my arms. Then what was? The answer took a long time to come. When it finally did, it arrived in a voice I'd never heard before. A wounded voice. My brother. I frowned. My Uncle Daniel had died long before I was born. The family rarely spoke about him. Almost never. He enlisted when he was 19. My father swallowed. He was killed overseas. The wind seemed to stop. For a moment, the world felt very quiet. I know. No. He shook his head. You know the facts. His eyes grew distant. I remember the funeral. The pain in his voice was unmistakable. I remember my mother crying every night. He stared toward the river. I remember my father never being the same again. I listened, not interrupting. For the first time in my life, my father was letting me see something beneath the armor. Something real. When you told me you'd enlisted, his voice cracked. All I could think about was Daniel. I sat perfectly still. Years of memories suddenly looked different. The arguments, the anger, the criticism, the constant disapproval. I thought I'd lose you too. The words hit me harder than I expected. My father rubbed his face. For a moment, he looked like an exhausted old man. Not the powerful businessman everyone knew. Just an old man carrying decades of grief. I was terrified. He laughed bitterly. And instead of admitting that, he shook his head. I punished you for it. The truth settled heavily between us. Not an excuse. An explanation. Those are very different things. I understood that. He understood it too. I should have been proud of you. His voice trembled. Instead, every promotion made me angry. I stared at him. Not because I doubted him. Because I believed him. Every word. I kept waiting for you to quit. He laughed softly. You never did. No. A faint smile appeared. No. For the first time that morning, we shared something close to humor. Then his smile vanished. His eyes filled with tears. Real tears. I had never seen my father cry. Not once. Not when his parents died. Not when businesses struggled. Not ever. Now tears rolled down his face. And he didn't even try to hide them. I failed you. The words came out broken. Raw. Honest. I failed you as a father. I felt my own eyes sting. Not because everything was suddenly fixed. Nothing was fixed. Years of damage don't disappear in one conversation. But honesty matters. Truth matters. And this was the first completely honest conversation we'd ever had. He looked at me. I am so sorry, Rachel. Not for the estate. Not for the investigation. Not for getting caught. For me. For us. For everything. The difference mattered. A lot. The wind moved through the trees again. Somewhere nearby a church bell rang. Neither of us spoke. The silence wasn't uncomfortable anymore. Just heavy. Human. My father wiped his eyes. I don't expect forgiveness. I looked toward the memorial wall. Rows of names. Rows of stories. Rows of people who had sacrificed. Life teaches difficult lessons. Sometimes far too late. Maybe this was one of them. Finally, I looked back at him. The man who had hurt me. The man who had failed me. The man who was still my father. And for the first time in 20 years, I honestly considered forgiving him. A month after my conversation with my father at the Veterans Memorial Park, the estate case finally came to an end. By then, most of the legal questions had been answered. The investigation had confirmed what the judge had suspected. Several changes to my grandfather's estate had been made improperly. Assets that should never have been redirected were restored. The final ruling wasn't dramatic. No shouting. No shocking television-style courtroom scene. Real life rarely works that way. Instead, there were documents, hearings, corrections, and eventually resolution. My grandfather's wishes were honored. The room went completely silent when the man on the phone said, "Yes, ma'am, we'll move forward under your command." I could feel Daniel's mother's eyes on me, sharp and confused. His father had just set down his fork, the faint clink echoing louder than it should have in that pristine dining room. No one said a word. Not yet. I stood there beside the hallway table, my back straight, my voice steady as I gave a final instruction. Keep it contained until I get back. I'll review everything personally. Yes, ma'am. The call ended. When I turned around, every face at that table had changed. And that's when I realized I hadn't planned for what came after. 3 hours earlier, I had stood in front of my closet holding 2 dresses. One was navy blue, tailored, the kind I wore to official functions when I needed to represent more than just myself. The other was older, soft cotton, faded at the seams, something I hadn't worn in years but couldn't quite throw away. I chose the old one. It wasn't a mistake, it was a decision. I slipped it on slowly, smoothing the fabric over my hips, catching my reflection in the mirror. No insignia, no polished shoes, no trace of rank or authority, just a woman in her late 30s with a simple dress and a calm expression. I pulled my hair back into a low, practical style, not the tight regulation bun I wore on base, but something softer, less defined. I left my makeup minimal, almost invisible. When I stepped out into the living room, Daniel looked up from his phone and paused. "You sure about that?" he asked. I smiled lightly. "It's just dinner." He hesitated. That small pause told me everything I needed to know. Daniel loved me. I didn't doubt that. But he also came from a world where appearances mattered. His parents had built a life around status, what you did, how you looked, who you knew. It wasn't cruel exactly. It was just ingrained. I was thinking, I said, slipping on my shoes, I might keep things simple tonight. Simple how? I'll just tell them I work in administration for the Army. He blinked. That's not exactly the full picture. No, I said calmly, it isn't. He studied me for a moment, searching my face. Why? I picked up my coat and met his gaze. Because I want to know who they are before they know who I am. That answer didn't sit comfortably with him. I could see it in the way his shoulders shifted. They're good people, he said, just traditional. I'm not trying to trick anyone, I replied. I just don't feel like leading with a title tonight. He nodded slowly, though the doubt didn't leave his eyes entirely. All right. But if it gets weird, I'll handle it. That part at least he believed. The drive to his parents' house took about 40 minutes. Late afternoon sunlight stretched across the highway, turning everything gold and quiet. Daniel kept one hand on the wheel, the other resting lightly near mine, though neither of us spoke much. I didn't mind the silence, I used it. In my line of work, you learn to read situations before you step into them. You learn to listen for what isn't said. And tonight, I had a feeling there would be plenty of that. When we pulled into the driveway, I took a moment before opening the door. The house was large but not flashy. Clean lines, well-kept lawn, a place built to signal success without needing to shout it. The kind of home where expectations lived in the walls. Daniel walked around to my side and opened the door for me, a small gesture, polite, practiced. You ready? He asked. I nodded, always. His mother opened the door before we even knocked. Daniel, she said warmly, pulling him into a brief embrace before turning to me. Her smile remained, but it shifted just slightly. And you must be, she began. Emily, I said, offering my hand. She took it, her grip light, her eyes scanning me in one quick, efficient glance. Dress, shoes, hair, no judgment spoken aloud, but I'd seen that look before. Welcome, she said, stepping aside. His father stood in the living room waiting. He didn't move forward immediately. He simply observed as we walked in. Dad, Daniel said this is Emily. I extended my hand again. It's nice to meet you, sir. He shook it firmly. You too. His tone was neutral, controlled. We exchanged a few polite words before moving into the sitting area. The room was arranged carefully, every piece of furniture in its proper place, every surface clean. His mother offered drinks. I accepted water. So, Emily, she said after a moment, settling into her chair, Daniel tells us you're in the military. Yes, ma'am. What do you do exactly? There it was, the question. I kept my voice even. I work in administration for the Army. A small pause followed. Not long, just enough. I see, she said. His father leaned back slightly. That must be stable work. It is. He nodded once as if confirming something for himself. The conversation moved on, but the shift had already happened. I felt it in the way his mother's questions changed from curiosity to evaluation, in the way his father stopped asking follow-ups, in the subtle, almost invisible recalibration of expectations. Daniel noticed it too. I saw it in the tightening of his jaw. But he didn't say anything. Not yet. By the time we moved to the dining table, the tone had settled into something quieter, polite, controlled. His mother had prepared a full meal: roast chicken, vegetables, fresh bread. Everything placed just so. We sat. And I waited. Because I had seen this before. Not in homes like this, not exactly. But in rooms where people made decisions based on what they thought you were worth. The only difference was, this time I had chosen to let them. I picked up my fork, steady as ever, and smiled gently across the table. Thank you for having me. And somewhere deep inside I knew. This dinner was going to reveal far more than anyone expected. Dinner began the way most formal family dinners do, quietly, with polite conversation and the soft clinking of silverware against porcelain. For a few minutes no one said anything that mattered. Daniel's mother passed the bread basket, her movements smooth and practiced. "Emily, help yourself," she said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Thank you," I replied, taking a small piece. His father carved the chicken with careful precision, placing portions on each plate, as if it were part of a routine he'd followed for years. There was a rhythm to the table, one that didn't include me yet. I waited. In my experience, people rarely show you who they are in the first 5 minutes. It's what comes after, when comfort sets in, when assumptions take hold, that tells the truth. So his mother said, finally settling into her chair, "How long have you been in the army?" "A little over 15 years, I answered. That was true. She raised her eyebrows slightly. "That's quite a long time for administrative work." "I've moved around a bit," I said. "Different assignments." His father nodded, but there was something behind it. Not approval, not quite skepticism either, just calculation. "And do you plan to stay in that role?" he asked. "For now, yes." Another pause, another shift. Daniel cleared his throat. "Emily's work is more complicated than that, actually." "It's all right," I said gently, placing my hand lightly over his wrist for just a moment. "I'm comfortable with what I do." That quieted him. But it didn't go unnoticed. His mother gave a small, polite smile. Of course. Stability is important, especially for a young couple thinking about the future. There it was again. Not unkind, not openly critical, but layered. "I agree," I said simply. She studied me for a second longer than necessary. "And your family, are they nearby?" "No, ma'am, they're back in Ohio." "Oh," she said, "small town." "Yes." That must have been quite an adjustment, moving into all this. Her hand gestured lightly around the dining room. "It was," I said, "but you get used to change." That answer seemed to settle something for her. Across the table, Daniel shifted in his seat. I could feel the tension building, not explosive, just quiet and persistent, like pressure behind a closed door. His father took a sip of wine before speaking again. "Daniel mentioned you met through mutual friends." "Yes, sir." "And how long have you been together?" "Just over a year." He nodded slowly. "A year isn't very long." "No," I agreed. Another pause. His mother set down her fork. "You'll have to forgive us," she said with a soft laugh. "We're just protective of our son." "I understand," I said. And I did. But understanding didn't mean accepting everything that came with it. "Daniel has always been very driven," she continued. "We've always encouraged him to aim high. I can see that. And we want to make sure he has a partner who can support that." There it was, said gently, carefully, but clearly. I met her gaze. Support comes in many forms. Her smile tightened just slightly. "Of course." Daniel finally spoke up. "Mom." "It's all right," I said again, calm but firm. "I appreciate your honesty." The table fell quiet for a moment. His father leaned back, folding his hands together. "In our experience," he said, "shared ambition is important in a marriage." "I agree," I said. He seemed almost surprised by that. "But ambition doesn't always look the same from the outside." That earned me a longer look. "What does it look like for you?" he asked. I considered the question for a moment. "It looks like commitment," I said. "Consistency, doing your job well even when no one is watching." "That sounds admirable," his mother said, though not particularly visible. I allowed a small smile. "Not everything that matters is." Silence again. But this time it felt different. Not just evaluation, but resistance. Halfway through the meal, Daniel's cousin Mark arrived. Late 30s, loud personality, the kind of man who filled a room without trying. "Sorry I'm late," he said, dropping into the empty chair beside me. "Work ran long." He gave me a quick glance. "You must be Emily." "Yes." "Mark," he said, offering his hand. "I've heard a little about you." "Only the good parts, I hope." He laughed. "Depends who you ask." Within minutes, he had taken over the conversation, steering it toward business investments and career paths. It didn't take long before the topic circled back to me. "So, Emily," he said, leaning back in his chair, "what do you do again?" "Administration in the Army." Daniel's mother answered before I could. Mark raised his eyebrows. "Ah, paperwork, huh?" "Among other things," I said. He grinned. "Well, someone's got to keep the machine running." I nodded. "That's true." He chuckled, clearly amused by his own comment. "I always figured the real action was somewhere else." "It depends on what you consider action," I replied. He waved it off. "Fair enough." But the tone had been set. From that point on, I became background. Not ignored entirely, just placed. Questions shifted away from me, conversations moved around me. Decisions about what mattered had already been made. Daniel tried once or twice to pull me back in. "Emily has a lot of responsibility, actually." But his voice didn't carry the weight it needed to. And I didn't push. Because I was watching, listening, learning. Toward the end of the meal, his mother brought out dessert homemade pie neatly sliced. "Emily," she said, setting a plate in front of me, "do you cook?" "Yes, ma'am." "What kind of dishes?" "Mostly simple ones, things I grew up with." She nodded. "That's nice." Then, almost as an afterthought, she added, "Daniel's schedule can be demanding. He'll need someone who can manage a home efficiently." I looked at her steadily. I've managed more complex systems than a household. The words came out before I softened them. "A small mistake." Her smile didn't change, but her eyes did. "I'm sure you have," she said. But the meaning was clear. Not in the way you think. The plates were cleared, chairs shifted, the evening moved toward its natural close. But the air hadn't eased. If anything, it had settled into something firmer, defined. Daniel walked me toward the hallway while his parents stepped into the kitchen. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "For what?" "They're just like that." "I know." "You didn't have to." "I did," I said gently. He looked at me, searching for something he couldn't quite name. "Did what he asked." I held his gaze for a moment. "Let them show me who they are." Before he could respond, my phone vibrated in my hand. I glanced down at the screen. And everything shifted. Because I knew that number. And calls like that didn't come without a reason. I took a slow breath. "Excuse me," I said, stepping away. As I walked toward the quiet corner of the hallway, I answered the call. "Yes." The voice on the other end was urgent but controlled. And in that moment I understood. This dinner was about to become something else entirely. "Yes, ma'am," the voice on the other end said. "We've got a situation developing. I need your guidance." I stepped a little farther down the hallway, lowering my voice just enough to keep the conversation private, but not so quiet that it sounded secretive. "What's the scope?" I asked. There was a brief pause, then a clear, concise response. "Preliminary reports indicate a containment issue on the south side of the base. Nothing public yet, but it's escalating. Command is asking for direction." I closed my eyes for a second, not in stress, but in focus. This was familiar ground, controlled pressure, limited time, decisions that mattered. "Who's on site?" I asked. "Colonel Harris is leading initial response. He's waiting on authorization to move resources." "Tell him he has it," I said, "but keep it contained. No unnecessary exposure. I want a full report within the hour." "Yes, ma'am." "And keep this off open channels." "Understood." The line went quiet for a moment, then returned with a softer tone. "We'll handle it." "I know you will," I said. The call ended. I stood there for a second longer, letting the shift settle. Then I turned back toward the dining room. The moment I stepped back in, I felt it. Not suspicion, not yet. But attention. Daniel was watching me closely. His parents had resumed their seats, though the conversation hadn't fully picked back up. "Everything all right?" his mother asked. "Yes, ma'am," I said, taking my seat again. "Just something from work." She nodded, but there was a new layer in her expression now. Curiosity sharpened. "Must be important," Mark added lightly. Sounded serious. Sometimes it is, I replied. He gave a small shrug, clearly not interested in pressing further. But his father was. What exactly do you handle? He asked. There it was again. The question. I folded my hands lightly in my lap. Administrative coordination. He studied me, at this hour. Work doesn't always follow a schedule, I said. That's true, he admitted. But he didn't look convinced. Daniel leaned forward slightly. Like I said, her role's more involved than it sounds. I glanced at him, then back at the table. It's nothing unusual. That answer seemed to close the door for now. But not entirely. Dessert resumed, though the tone had shifted. Subtle, quiet, but different. Mark tapped his fork lightly against his plate. You know, I've always wondered how the military handles stuff like that, late calls, emergencies, all that. It depends on the situation, I said. Seems stressful. It can be. He nodded. I don't think I could do it. I smiled faintly. You'd be surprised what people can handle when they have to. He chuckled. Maybe. But he didn't press further. His mother, however, had gone quiet. She watched me now, not with dismissal, but with calculation. Something didn't fit anymore. And she knew it. After dessert, we moved back into the sitting room. Coffee was served. The evening was supposed to wind down. But instead, it tightened. Daniel sat beside me closer than before. His hand rested lightly near mine, not touching, but present. His father took his usual chair, crossing one leg over the other. So he said after a moment, Daniel tells us you've been considering next steps. I knew what he meant. Yes, sir. Marriage is a serious commitment. I agree. And it requires a certain level of alignment. I met his gaze. In what sense? In lifestyle, expectations, long-term planning. I nodded. Those things matter. And do you feel your current role supports that, he asked? The question wasn't about my job. Not really. It was about value. I answered carefully. I believe I bring stability, discipline, and commitment into any situation I'm part of. His expression didn't change. But I added gently. He leaned forward slightly. But I'm not sure I understand how your position fits into the kind of future Daniel has been building. There it was. Clear, direct. No more soft edges. Daniel shifted beside me. Dad. It's a fair question, I said calmly. He paused, perhaps expecting resistance. Instead, I continued. You're asking whether I meet your expectations. I'm asking whether you're the right partner for my son. I held his gaze. That depends, I said. On what? On whether you're evaluating me based on who I am or what you assume I am. The room went still. Mark let out a quiet breath. Daniel's mother set her cup down carefully. His father's eyes narrowed just slightly. And which do you think it is, he asked. I think I said evenly, you've made a decision without having all the information. He leaned back again. Then perhaps you should provide it. A simple statement, but heavy. Daniel looked at me, his expression caught somewhere between concern and curiosity. He didn't know everything. Not fully. I had told him enough, but not all. Not like this. Not in this room. I could feel the moment building. The line approaching. I had planned to wait. To observe. To leave with quiet conclusions. But plans don't always hold. Not when pressure changes. His mother spoke next, her tone softer but no less pointed. Emily, she said, we don't mean to make you uncomfortable. We just want what's best for Daniel. I understand, I said. And from what we've seen, we're not sure you fully align with that. There it was. Not cruel, but final. A judgment. I took a slow breath. Not out of frustration, but clarity. Because in that moment I knew something important. They weren't bad people. They were just certain. Certain of how the world worked. Certain of what success looked like. Certain of what mattered. And they had placed me outside of that. Without knowing. Without asking. I set my cup down gently. May I ask you something, I said? His father nodded. If I had told you something different earlier about my work, would this conversation be different? He didn't hesitate. Yes. Honest. At least that. And that's exactly why I didn't, I said quietly. The silence that followed was deeper than before. Not tense. Just real. Daniel turned toward me fully now. Emily. I met his eyes briefly. Then I looked back at his parents. There are things about my work that aren't easy to explain in a few sentences, I said, and I didn't feel the need to lead with them tonight. His father folded his hands together. Then perhaps now would be the time. The room waited. Every eye on me. Every assumption hanging in the air. I could have said it plainly. I could have ended the uncertainty in a single sentence. But something held me back. Not hesitation. Not fear. Just timing. Because the truth once spoken doesn't just inform. It changes everything. And I wasn't sure they were ready for that. Before I could respond, my phone vibrated again. Same number. Same urgency. I glanced down. Then back up. Excuse me, I said. I stood stepping away from the room once more. But this time, I knew they were listening. I answered. Yes. The voice came through immediately. Yes, ma'am. Situation is escalating. We need confirmation on next steps now. I didn't lower my voice this time. I didn't step as far away. Proceed with containment, I said clearly. Authorize full response. I'll take command when I arrive. Yes, ma'am. I ended the call. Turned. And walked back into the room. No one spoke. Because now, they had heard enough to know. Something wasn't what it seemed. When I stepped back into the living room, I didn't rush to sit down. For a moment, I simply stood there. Not to make a point, not to create a scene, but because I understood very clearly that the room I had walked out of was not the same one I was walking back into. Daniel's mother was still holding her coffee cup, though she hadn't taken a sip. His father sat straighter now, his posture no longer relaxed. Mark had stopped pretending to be casual, his attention fixed directly on me. And Daniel, he was looking at me like he was seeing something for the first time. Not entirely new, but not entirely familiar either. I took a step forward and returned to my seat, placing my phone calmly beside my cup. No one spoke right away. The silence stretched, not uncomfortable but expectant. Finally, his father cleared his throat. That sounded significant, he said. I nodded once. It is. He leaned forward slightly, care to elaborate. There it was. The invitation. Or perhaps the request. I folded my hands together on the table, resting them lightly against each other. I handle situations that require coordination, I said. Mark let out a small disbelieving laugh. That's one way to put it. I met his gaze not unkindly. It's an accurate one. His smile faded just a little. Daniel shifted beside me. Emily, what exactly is going on? His tone wasn't accusatory, it was searching. I turned to him. There's an issue at the base, I said. It's being managed. You said you'd take command, he replied quietly. Yes. That single word changed something. I saw it land. Not just with him. With everyone. His mother set her cup down more carefully this time. You're in charge of something like that. Sometimes I said. His father studied me now, not with dismissal but with focus. That's not typical for administrative personnel, he said. No, I agreed, it isn't. Another pause. He waited. And this time I didn't deflect. I didn't soften. I simply spoke. I didn't come here tonight to mislead anyone, I said calmly, but I also didn't feel the need to introduce myself by my title. Daniel's voice was quieter now. What title? I turned to him fully. And for the first time since I had walked into that house, I answered without holding anything back. I'm a 2-star general, I said, in the United States Army. The words settled into the room like something physical. Heavy. Real. And impossible to ignore. Mark blinked. Once. Twice. As if waiting for a punchline that never came. Daniel's mother didn't move at all. And his father simply stared. You're serious, he said after a moment. Yes, sir. The silence that followed was different from the others. Not tense. Not uncertain. Just undeniable. Because there are certain truths that don't leave room for interpretation. And that was one of them. Mark leaned back slowly in his chair. That's not something people usually leave out. I wasn't trying to hide it, I said. I just didn't think it should define the conversation. He gave a short laugh, though it didn't carry the same confidence as before. Well, it kind of does now. I didn't respond to that. Because he wasn't wrong. Across from me, Daniel's mother finally spoke. "You're telling us," she said carefully, "that you command troops." "Yes, ma'am." "How many?" "Enough that it matters." That answer wasn't meant to be evasive. It was meant to be respectful. She absorbed it slowly. "And you've been doing this while presenting yourself as someone who works in administration," I finished gently. "Which is still true, just not the whole picture." Her eyes moved over me again, but this time the assessment was different. Not dismissive. Reevaluating. His father exhaled quietly, leaning back into his chair. "I see," he said. 2 simple words. But they carried weight. Because what he saw now wasn't what he had expected. Daniel hadn't said anything. Not yet. I turned toward him again. "I didn't tell you everything I said, and I understand if that feels like a breach of trust." He looked at me, his expression caught between disbelief and something deeper. "You told me enough," he said slowly. "I just didn't realize how much more there was." "That's fair." "Why not just say it?" he asked. "Because I needed to know something first." "What?" I met his eyes. "Who you were when none of it mattered." He held my gaze for a long moment, then nodded once. Not fully satisfied, but understanding. His father leaned forward again, resting his elbows on his knees. "You understand how this looks from our perspective," he said. "I do. You come into our home, present yourself one way, and then—" "I present myself as I am," I said calmly, just without context. "That's not a small omission." "No," I agreed, "it isn't." He studied me carefully. "And what exactly were you hoping to learn?" I considered the question. "Whether I would be treated with respect," I said, before any titles were involved. The honesty in that answer landed harder than anything else I had said that evening. Because it wasn't about power. It wasn't about position. It was about something simpler. And more revealing. His mother shifted slightly in her seat. "We didn't mean any disrespect," she said. "I know," I replied. "But you have to understand," she continued, "we were trying to evaluate." "Me," I said. "Yes." "And now?" I asked. She hesitated. Because now, the evaluation had changed. Not just in outcome, but in direction. Mark cleared his throat. "Well, I guess that explains the phone calls." "Yes," I said. "And the take command part," he added. "Yes." He shook his head slowly. "Didn't see that coming." "That was the point," I said quietly. The room settled again. But this time there was no returning to what it had been. Because once assumptions break, they don't rebuild the same way. Daniel's father stood up after a moment, walking slowly toward the window. He didn't say anything right away. He just stood there looking out at the darkening yard. Then finally he spoke. "I may have misjudged you," he said. It wasn't an apology. Not yet. But it was movement. And sometimes that's where change begins. I nodded once. "We all make judgments," I said. "The question is what we do after." He turned slightly, considering that. Daniel's mother looked at me again. But now there was no trace of dismissal. Only reconsideration. And perhaps something else. Something quieter. I picked up my cup, taking a slow sip. The coffee had gone cold. But I didn't mind. Because the evening had shifted. Not into conflict. Not into triumph. But into something far more real. The moment after the truth is known. When people have to decide who they are going to be next. For a while no one spoke. It wasn't the strained silence from earlier in the evening. It was heavier than that, more deliberate, the kind that settles in after something shifts and everyone is trying to understand what it means. Daniel's father was still by the window, his back to us, one hand resting lightly against the frame. His shoulders had lost that rigid certainty from before. His mother sat across from me, hands folded, now her posture straighter, not out of formality but awareness. Mark looked down at his empty cup, then back up at me as if trying to recalibrate everything he'd said over the past hour. And Daniel? He hadn't moved. He was still turned toward me, his expression quieter than I had ever seen it. Not angry. Not even upset. Just processing. I set my cup down gently. "I didn't mean to create a situation," I said. "That wasn't my intention." Daniel's mother shook her head slowly. "You didn't?" she said. "Not exactly." She paused, then added, "But you did show us something we weren't expecting." I nodded once. That's fair. Mark let out a short breath. I'll be honest, I feel a little ridiculous. That wasn't the goal either, I said. He gave a small self-aware smile, still. Across the room, Daniel's father turned back toward us. I think he said carefully we may have approached this the wrong way. No one responded immediately, because those words, simple as they were, carried weight. He walked back toward the table slower than before and took his seat again. I've spent most of my life evaluating people quickly, he continued. It's how I was trained. Business, negotiations. You learn to assess value risk potential. I listened. And tonight he said I did exactly that. His gaze met mine. But I did it without all the information. I held his eyes. Yes, sir, I said quietly. You did. There was no accusation in my voice. Just truth. He exhaled slowly, and I let that judgment shape how I treated you. This time the room stayed silent a little longer. Because now, we were no longer talking about assumptions. We were talking about responsibility. Daniel shifted beside me. Dad? But his father raised a hand slightly, not to stop him, but to finish his thought. I don't like being wrong, he said. But I dislike even more the idea that I was unfair. I considered that. Then I nodded. That matters, I said. His mother looked between us, her expression softer now. We weren't trying to be unkind, she said. I know, I replied. But we were, she admitted. That was the first real acknowledgement. And it didn't come with defensiveness. Just honesty. Daniel leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. I should have said something earlier, he said, when I saw where the conversation was going. I turned toward him. You tried. Not enough, he said. I didn't argue with that. Because growth doesn't come from being reassured, it comes from being aware. He looked at me again. I didn't fully understand what you do. Not like this. That's on me, I said. I chose not to explain it. Why, he asked again more quietly this time. I took a breath. Because I needed to know if you saw me, before everything else. And I held his gaze. I think you're still figuring that out. He didn't flinch. He nodded once. That's fair. Mark cleared his throat again, shifting in his seat. So, just so I'm clear, he said, glancing between us, you're actually in charge of a base. Yes. And those calls are part of the job. He let out a low whistle. I made a joke about paperwork. I remember, I said. He winced slightly. Yeah, about that. It's all right, I said. You were working with the information you had. That's not much of an excuse, he replied. No, I agreed, but it is an explanation. He nodded slowly, absorbing that. Daniel's mother reached for her cup again, though her hands moved more carefully now. I think she said we've spent a long time measuring people by things that are easy to see. I didn't interrupt. And we forgot that not everything important presents itself that way. Her eyes met mine. That's on us. I inclined my head slightly. It takes awareness to recognize that. It took you showing us, she said. That wasn't my intention, I replied. Maybe not, she said, but it was the result. Daniel's father leaned forward again, his tone steadier now. You said earlier he began that you wanted to see who we were, before we knew who you were. Yes, sir? And now you have... I do. He held my gaze. And what have you concluded? The question wasn't defensive. It was direct. And it deserved a direct answer. I considered my words carefully. I think you care deeply about your son, I said, and you want to protect what he's built. He nodded once. But I also think, I continued, that you rely heavily on visible markers to determine someone's worth. He didn't argue, because he knew it was true. And that can lead to incomplete conclusions. The room stayed quiet, because sometimes the simplest truths are the hardest to respond to. After a moment, he spoke again. You're not wrong. It wasn't easy for him to say. That much was clear. I've spent decades building a certain way of thinking, he added. It doesn't change overnight. I wouldn't expect it to, I said. But it can change, he said. Yes. That word carried more weight than anything else in the conversation. Because it wasn't about the past anymore. It was about what came next. Daniel reached for my hand this time gently. Not out of habit. Out of intention. I'm still here, he said quietly. I know, I replied. And I'm not going anywhere. I looked at him for a long moment. Then stand with me, I said. Not a demand. Not a test. Just a truth. He nodded. I will. The tension that had filled the house earlier was gone. Not replaced with comfort. Not yet. But with something more important. Honesty. And the beginning of understanding. As the evening drew toward its close, things felt different. Not lighter, but clearer. And sometimes that's what matters most. Because clarity doesn't erase what happened, but it gives you a chance to decide what to do with it. When we finally stood to leave, Daniel's mother walked us to the door. Thank you for coming, she said. Thank you for having me, I replied. This time the words carried more meaning. She hesitated for a brief moment, then added, We'd like to see you again soon. I nodded, I'd like that. And I meant it. Because this wasn't about proving anything anymore. It was about whether something real could grow from what had been revealed. Outside, the air was cool and quiet. Daniel opened the car door for me again, just as he had earlier. But this time the gesture felt different. Less practiced. More present. As I settled into the seat, I looked back at the house one last time. Not with judgment. Not with satisfaction. But with a quiet understanding. Because tonight hadn't been about showing who I was. It had been about showing something else entirely. What people reveal when they think you don't matter. And what they do when they realize you do. The drive back to my apartment was quiet. Daniel kept both hands on the wheel, eyes forward, jaw set, in that way men sometimes have when they are trying to think and not speak too soon. I appreciated that about him. A careless sentence can bruise more deeply than a hard one, especially after a night like that. I watched the road lights pass across the windshield in long yellow streaks. For most people, the evening would have felt like a victory. A room full of people had underestimated me. Then they had learned the truth. Their faces had changed. Their tone had changed. Their certainty had cracked. That is the kind of moment some people wait years for. But I didn't feel victorious. I felt tired. Not physically. I had worked longer days under far worse pressure. This was different. This was the quiet kind of tired that comes when you realize love does not only ask whether two people care for each other. It asks whether they can stand together when other people make that difficult. Daniel finally spoke when we stopped at a red light. I should have told them more before tonight. I looked at him. He didn't turn toward me. Not your rank. That wasn't mine to tell. But I should have prepared them better. Or at least warned you more clearly about how they could be. I had a sense. That's not the same. No, I said, it isn't. The light turned green. He drove on. After a few more seconds, he said, Were you testing me too? I took my time before answering. Yes. He absorbed that without reacting. I figured, he said quietly. I wasn't trying to trap you. I know. But I needed to see whether you would let me sit there alone. That one hurt him. I saw it in his face, even in the dim light. I did, he said. Not completely. But enough. I didn't answer right away because there was no kindness in pretending he was wrong. Yes, I said, enough. He swallowed and nodded. That was one thing I had always respected about Daniel. He could be proud, but he wasn't dishonest with himself once the truth found him. I froze, he said. I kept thinking if I pushed back too hard it would make things worse. That's a common mistake, I said softly. He gave a sad little laugh. That sounds like something you'd say in a briefing. It probably is. For the first time all night, a small warmth passed between us. Then it faded back into seriousness. I love my parents, he said, but I saw it tonight. I saw what they were doing. And what were they doing? They were measuring you. I nodded. And I let them, he added. That's the part you need to remember. He pulled into the parking lot of my building a few minutes later but didn't turn off the engine right away. I don't want a marriage where you have to defend yourself alone, he said. Neither do I. I don't want you to feel like you have to hide who you are around my family. I didn't hide because of them, I said. I withheld because of what I needed to learn. He turned toward me then. And what did you learn about me? I looked at him for a long moment. That you love me, I said. But love needs a backbone. He looked down at his hands. That's fair. It's not meant to wound you. I know, he said, but it should. That answer stayed with me. Because sometimes a wound is not punishment. Sometimes it is the place where growth begins. 2 days passed before his mother called. I was in my office at the base when my assistant knocked lightly and opened the door. "Ma'am, Daniel's mother is on your personal line." I looked up from the folder in front of me. That surprised me. "Thank you. Put her through." A moment later, her voice came over the phone. "Emily." "Yes, Mrs. Whitmore." There was a pause. "Please call me Patricia." I leaned back slightly. "All right, Patricia. I hope I'm not interrupting anything important." I looked at the stack of reports on my desk, then at the clock. "You're all right." Another pause. "I wanted to apologize." I said nothing. Not because I wanted to make her uncomfortable, but because an apology deserves room. Too often, people rush to rescue others from the hard part of saying it. She continued. "I judged you before I knew you. I asked questions that sounded polite but were not kind, and I made assumptions about your worth based on a dress, a job title, and my own narrow idea of what success looks like." Her voice wavered slightly at the end. "That mattered." "I appreciate you saying that," I said. "I've been thinking about it since you left. Harold has too, though he is slower to admit things." That made me smile faintly. "I understand. I don't expect you to forget it." "I won't." "No," she said softly, "I suppose you shouldn't." There was honesty in that too. Then she asked, "Would you consider coming to dinner again, just you and Daniel? No cousin, no interrogation, just dinner." I looked through the window of my office out toward the flag, moving in the afternoon wind. "I would consider it," I said. "That's more than I deserve." Maybe I replied, but it's enough for a start. That evening, Daniel came over with takeout from a little Italian place near my building. He brought 2 paper bags, one tired smile, and no excuses. We ate at my kitchen table, the kind with one uneven leg and a scratch near the corner from when I had moved it myself after a long deployment. Halfway through dinner, he said, "Mom called you." "She did." "She called me after." I waited. "She said she apologized." "She did." He nodded. "Dad wants to talk too, in person." "That will be harder for him." "I know. Are you ready for that?" He looked at me. "I think I am." That wasn't my question. He set his fork down. Then he said, "I'm ready to stand beside you this time." I believed he meant it. But life had taught me that meaning well is only the first step. The real test comes when comfort is threatened, when family disapproves, when old patterns ask to be obeyed. So I didn't say good. I didn't say that fixes it. I simply reached across the table and took his hand. "We'll see," I said. He nodded. And for now, that was enough. The second dinner happened the following Sunday. This time I did not wear the old dress. I also did not wear a uniform. I chose a simple gray blouse, dark slacks, and a necklace my mother had given me before she passed. Nothing flashy, nothing hidden, just me. When Daniel and I arrived, his father opened the door. Harold Whitmore looked smaller than he had the first night. Not weak, just less armored. "Emily," he said. "Mr. Whitmore." He stepped aside. "Please come in." The house looked the same, but it felt different. There were no extra guests, no performative table setting, no cousin making jokes from the side. Patricia greeted me in the kitchen with a sincere hug that lasted just long enough to be awkward, but not false. Dinner was simple: pot roast potatoes, green beans. Real food, no performance. For a while we talked about ordinary things. Weather, Daniel's work, a neighbor's old maple tree coming down in the last storm. Then Harold set down his fork. "I owe you an apology," he said. Everyone went still. He looked directly at me. "I measured you by the wrong things. Worse than that, I allowed my pride to make me comfortable doing it." I listened, hands resting in my lap. "I have spent years telling myself I'm a good judge of character," he continued. "But that night I was not judging character. I was judging status." His voice grew quieter. "And if you had not turned out to be someone important, I might never have seen the problem." That was the first thing he said that truly reached me, because it was the truth beneath the truth. I nodded slowly. "That matters more than the apology," I said. He looked confused. I explained. "You didn't just regret misjudging a general. You recognized you would have owed the same respect to an administrative worker." His face tightened with feeling. "Yes," he said, "that's what I'm trying to learn." And in that moment I believed him. Not completely. Not perfectly. But enough to begin. The second dinner ended without tension. That more than anything told me something had shifted. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough. When Daniel and I stepped out onto the front porch, Patricia followed us to the door again. This time her smile wasn't measured or polite, it was softer, uncertain, but real. "I'm glad you came," she said. "So am I replied. And I meant it. Because reconciliation doesn't always feel warm at first. Sometimes it feels like two people choosing not to walk away. Harold stood just behind her, one hand resting on the doorframe. He didn't say much as we left, but he gave a small nod. It was a simple gesture. But it carried weight. The drive home felt different from the one a week before. There was still quiet between Daniel and me, but it wasn't heavy anymore. It was thoughtful, settled. After a few minutes, he reached over and took my hand without looking away from the road. "They meant it," he said. "I know. I've never seen my dad talk like that. People change when they're willing to see themselves clearly." He let out a slow breath. I almost didn't. I turned toward him, "But you did." "Because of you." "No," I said gently, "because you chose to." That mattered. Because change forced by someone else rarely lasts. But change chosen, earned, that stays. He nodded slightly as if storing that away. "I don't want to ever put you in that position again," he said. "You will," I replied calmly. He blinked. "What?" I smiled faintly. "Not like that, but life has a way of testing people in different forms." He thought about that. "So what do I do when it happens again?" "Stand sooner," I said. "Speak earlier. Don't wait for things to become uncomfortable before you decide what you believe." He was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded. "I can do that." "I believe you can." A few weeks passed. Life returned to its usual rhythm. Early mornings, long days, brief calls that carried more weight than words, the steady responsibility that came with a role I had never taken lightly. At the base, nothing had changed. Rank still mattered. Decisions still had consequences. People still stood when I entered a room. But something inside me had settled differently. Because outside of that world beyond the gates, beyond the structure, I had been reminded of something just as important. Who you are when none of that is visible. And how people treat you when they don't know. One afternoon, as I was reviewing a set of reports, my assistant stepped in. "Ma'am, you have a visitor." I glanced up. "Who is it?" "Mr. Whitmore." I paused for a fraction of a second. "Send him in." Harold stepped into my office with a level of formality that hadn't been there before. Not stiff, just respectful. "General," he said. "Mr. Whitmore." He looked around briefly, taking in the room, the flags, the maps, the quiet order of everything. "This is impressive," he said. "It's functional," I replied. He gave a small nod, then sat when I gestured to the chair across from my desk. "I didn't come to take much of your time," he said. "You're here. That means it matters." He accepted that. For a moment he seemed to search for the right words. "I've been thinking a lot," he said finally. "About that night, about how easily I made up my mind about you." I listened. "I built a career on reading people," he continued, "and I got comfortable believing I was good at it. That happens. But I wasn't reading you," he said. "I was reading what I expected to see." "That's more common than you think." He nodded slowly. "I wanted to thank you," he said. That surprised me. "For what?" "For not using your position to make a point." I leaned back slightly. That wouldn't have taught anything. "No," he agreed. "It would have just made me defensive." "That's not the same as learning." He let out a quiet breath. "Exactly." There was a pause. Then he added, "I've been trying to look at people differently since then." "How so?" "By asking myself one question first." I waited. "What if I'm wrong?" I nodded. "That's a good place to start." When he left, I sat there for a few minutes longer than usual. Not thinking about work, not thinking about rank. Just reflecting. Because in all my years of service, I had learned a great deal about leadership. About responsibility. About making decisions when the cost of being wrong was high. But that night and everything that followed had reminded me of something just as important. That leadership doesn't begin with authority. It begins with how you see people. And whether you give them the dignity of being more than your first impression. A month later, Daniel and I stood together at a small family gathering. Nothing formal, just a backyard barbecue at his parents' house. This time there were no questions about my job. No careful evaluations. No quiet tests. Instead, Patricia handed me a plate and asked about my week. Mark, still a little embarrassed, kept his jokes light and harmless. And Harold simply treated me as part of the family. Not because of what I was, but because of who I had shown myself to be, and who he had chosen to become. As the sun began to set, Daniel stepped closer to me, his hand resting lightly at my back. "You were right," he said.
About what?
"That night wasn't about proving who you are." I looked at him. "It was about showing who everyone else was." I smiled softly. "And what we chose to do after that." He nodded. "And I'm glad we didn't walk away." "So am I. If there's one thing I've learned, it's this. People will show you who they are when they think you have nothing to offer them. That moment, quiet, unguarded, is where truth lives. But what matters more is what happens next. Whether they stay the same, or choose to grow, and whether you give them the space to do it. If this story meant something to you, if you've ever been judged too quickly, or if you've ever had to face your own assumptions, take a moment to reflect on it. And if you believe stories like this matter, consider sharing it with someone who might need the reminder. Because sometimes the smallest shift in how we see each other can change everything. The first thing my father said after I answered the phone was, "The bank's taking the house. What did you do?" His voice was sharp with panic, stripped of the cold authority he had used on me my whole life. In the background, I could hear my mother crying, papers rustled, a television blared somewhere in the house. I remember smiling, not because I was happy, not because revenge had ever been something I dreamed about, but because for the first time in 42 years, Frank Reeves sounded afraid, and I wasn't the one standing there shaking. I quietly ended the call. Then I looked through the window of my motel room at the gray Virginia morning and let myself remember how all of it had started. It had begun exactly 1 week earlier. At 5:03 on a Monday morning, someone started pounding on my apartment door hard enough to rattle the brass unit number screwed into the frame. I woke instantly. 20 years in Army intelligence teaches you to wake fast. For a moment I thought I was back in Afghanistan, half asleep in a plywood bunk, while incoming alarms screamed through the dark. My heart slammed against my ribs before my mind caught up with where I was. Fort Belvoir, Virginia. Officer housing. Stateside. Safe. Then the pounding came again. Major Reeves Military Police, open the door. I was already out of bed, my bare feet cold against the hardwood floor. My apartment was neat, everything exactly where it belonged. Habit, discipline, order had shaped my life for more than 2 decades. I threw on a robe and opened the door. 2 MPs stood there in full uniform. Behind them was a man in civilian clothes holding a leather folder. The older MP avoided my eyes. That was my first warning. The civilian introduced himself as Special Agent Thomas Keating with Army Criminal Investigation Division. "Major Abigail Reeves," he said, his voice clipped and formal, "you are being placed under immediate administrative suspension, pending investigation into unauthorized access and transfer of classified financial intelligence records." For a moment, the words didn't register. Unauthorized access. Transfer. I stared at him. There has to be some mistake. I'm afraid not. He handed me papers. Legal language blurred across the page. My security clearance was suspended effective immediately. My command authority was revoked pending investigation. I was prohibited from entering secure facilities or accessing military systems. It felt unreal, like hearing details from someone else's life. I had spent 21 years building my career. West Point. 2 overseas tours. Bronze Star. Countless nights under fluorescent lights tracking financial trails through hostile networks. And now some stranger was standing in my doorway, dismantling all of it before sunrise. "I want my JAG representative." "You'll have one by 800. The younger MP shifted uncomfortably. He knew me. I recognized him too, Private Morales, fresh-faced kid from Texas. I'd once helped him get emergency leave when his father had a stroke. Now he stood there while another man confiscated my government-issued laptop and credentials. That was how quickly dignity can vanish. By 6:30, the rumors had already started. Military communities are small. News moves faster than wildfire. By 7, I had 3 texts from officers asking if the allegations were true. By 8, silence. No one wants proximity to disgrace. I sat in my apartment until 10, staring at my blank television screen. Then I did the one thing I hadn't done in years. I drove to my parents' house. They lived in Columbia, Maryland, in the same neat colonial home where I'd grown up. White shutters, blue hydrangeas, American flag hanging proudly from the porch. Frank Reeves believed deeply in appearances. A polished lawn meant discipline. Pressed shirts meant respectability. Children who succeeded reflected well on their parents. Children who stumbled were an embarrassment to be corrected. I had spent most of my life trying to earn his approval. Even West Point hadn't fully done it. He'd shaken my hand at graduation and said, "Not bad." That was the closest thing to pride I'd ever received. I pulled into their driveway just after noon. For a second, sitting there with my hands gripping the wheel, I was 16 again, hoping home would feel safe. I rang the bell. My mother answered. Elaine Reeves looked smaller than I remembered, softer somehow, her silver hair pinned neatly back. The moment she saw my face, her expression changed. Fear. Not concern. Fear. "Abby." "Mom, I need to talk to Dad." She hesitated. Then my father appeared behind her. Frank Reeves looked exactly as he always had, straight-backed iron gray hair, crisp button-down shirt tucked neatly into pressed slacks. Even retired, he dressed like the world was watching. His eyes landed on me, then narrowed. I saw the news. It isn't true. Military police don't show up for innocent people. I stared at him. "Dad, I'm being framed." He folded his arms. "You've brought enough shame to this family." The words landed harder than I expected. My mother looked down. Not defending me. Not saying my name. Just looking down. Then my father said the sentence I will never forget. "Don't drag our family name down with you." I laughed once, sharp and disbelieving. "Are you serious?" Without answering, he stepped outside and dropped my old deployment duffel bag onto the porch. I stared at it. "What is this?" "We cleared out the things you left here." Confusion hit me first. Then dread. I reached for my phone and opened my banking app. Balance $413.72. I froze. Number. No. The account had held nearly $80,000. Savings from deployments. Combat pay. Years of careful planning for retirement. My father had co-signed emergency access years ago before my first deployment in case something happened overseas. I looked up at him, my pulse roaring in my ears. "You emptied my account." "We protected family assets from seizure." My mouth went dry. That was my money. It was under our family name. Then he looked me straight in the eye and said, calm, as if discussing weather, "Never use our family name again." My mother began crying quietly behind him. But she said nothing. And somehow that hurt more. I picked up my duffel. No shouting. No pleading. Military training teaches control. So I turned and walked back to my car. I drove south until Maryland disappeared in the rearview mirror. By nightfall, I checked into a roadside motel off I-95 with faded floral bedspreads and humming fluorescent lights. And for the first time since I was 18 years old, I had nowhere to go. That was the night I realized something harder than betrayal. Sometimes the people who abandon you were never really standing with you at all. The motel room smelled faintly of bleach and stale cigarette smoke. That smell stayed with me all week. Even now, months later, I sometimes catch a trace of disinfectant in a hospital hallway or an airport restroom, and I'm right back there sitting on the edge of that sagging mattress with my army duffel at my feet, staring at a future that had gone blank overnight. The first morning after my parents threw me out, I woke before dawn out of habit. For 21 years, Reveille had been my clock, whether I was stationed in Virginia, South Korea, or halfway across a desert under blackout conditions. My body still expected purpose at 0500. Instead, there was only silence. No command schedule. No secure briefings. No morning reports waiting in my inbox. Just the buzz of the motel's ancient air conditioner and the sick feeling that my life had been paused by someone else's hand. I sat up slowly and reached for my phone. Nothing. No messages from command. No texts from colleagues. No calls from my parents. The isolation felt surgical. as if every thread connecting me to the world had been cut cleanly at once. For a while, I simply sat there and listened to the traffic passing on Interstate 95 beyond the window. Then discipline took over. I showered, pressed my civilian clothes as neatly as I could, made the bed. Small things. Order is often the only defense against panic. At 800 sharp, my temporary legal liaison called. Captain Laura Kim, Judge Advocate General's Corps. Her voice was professional but kind. Major Reeves, I've reviewed the preliminary allegations. And, a pause. This is unusual. That got my attention. How unusual. The access logs show your credentials authorized financial intelligence transfers at 02:17 hours last Thursday. I was asleep in my quarters. I know, base access logs confirm you never left your apartment. A quiet tension entered her voice. Someone either cloned your credentials or they had elevated system override access. I sat straighter. Which means this wasn't random. Number. For the first time since the MPS had appeared at my door, my fear sharpened into focus. I had spent years tracking financial fraud through military contracting systems. If someone had used my credentials to move classified financial records, they either wanted money or they wanted me blamed for finding something I shouldn't have. Laura's voice lowered. Officially, I shouldn't say more, but unofficially, Major, this smells wrong. After we hung up, I stared at the wall for a long time. Then I opened my notebook. Paper, pen, old school. When systems are compromised, analog survives. I began writing every case I'd touched in the last 6 months. Defense vendors. Logistics contractors. Supply chain discrepancies. Payment irregularities. Halfway down page 3, one name stopped me cold. Redstone Federal Logistics. 3 months earlier, I had flagged unusual transaction layering through their overseas subcontractors. Nothing dramatic at first glance, just enough inconsistency to suggest laundering if someone knew where to look. I had submitted a recommendation for expanded audit review. 2 days later, I'd been told higher command would handle it. Then silence. Now I was under investigation. My instincts stirred. This wasn't coincidence. At noon, there was a knock at my motel door. Every muscle tightened. When I opened it, Colonel Daniel Mercer stood there holding 2 coffees. Retired 3 years now, Mercer had once been my commanding officer and the closest thing I'd ever had to a professional father. Tall and broad even in his 60s, with silver hair cropped short and eyes that missed nothing, he looked exactly as he had the day he pinned my oak leaves on my uniform. "You look terrible," he said. I almost laughed. That obvious? Abigail, I've interrogated cartel financiers with better posture. That made me smile despite myself. He handed me coffee and stepped inside. We sat by the window while morning traffic hissed past outside. He listened while I told him everything. The MPs. My parents. The missing money. Redstone. When I finished, he was quiet. Then he nodded slowly. I was afraid of this. My stomach tightened. You know something? Not enough to prove anything. He folded his hands. 3 weeks ago, a friend at the Pentagon called me. Internal oversight had concerns about procurement fraud tied to Redstone and several shell contractors. I felt my pulse quicken. How high does it go? High enough that if you got close to exposing it, someone would notice. The room felt smaller. You think I was set up? I think someone with system-level access used your credentials because they knew your audit flags would make you believable. He leaned forward. Listen carefully, Abigail. Truth in Washington moves slow, but it always leaves footprints. That sentence settled into me like an anchor. For the first time all week, I could breathe. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't disgraced. I was inconvenient. And inconvenient people get erased if they stop paying attention. After Mercer left, I worked. Not officially. Not on any military system. But I knew enough about contractor reporting structures to map likely shell pathways by hand. Hours passed. Outside daylight faded to dusk. Around 7, my phone buzzed. Dad. I stared at his name. Frank Reeves had not called once to ask if I was safe. Not once. Now his name glowed across my screen like a command. I let it ring out. A minute later, voicemail. Then another call. Another voicemail. By midnight, there were 6. I didn't listen. Not yet. Instead, I sat by the motel window and watched headlights sweep across the parking lot. Somewhere out there, powerful people thought they had buried me. At the same time, somewhere north in Maryland, my father was calling with growing urgency. For reasons I didn't yet understand, both sides had suddenly remembered I existed. And experience had taught me one thing. When people who've ignored you suddenly need your attention, the truth is usually about to surface. I slept with my notebook open beside me. And for the first time since military police had pounded on my door, I dreamed not of losing everything, but of getting it back. The 7th call came at 6:14 the next morning. I was already awake, sitting at the little motel desk with my notebook open and a stale cup of coffee cooling beside me. Dawn was creeping through the thin curtains, laying pale stripes across the carpet. Dad's name flashed across my screen again. For a moment, I considered ignoring it. Then I answered, "Hello." The silence on the other end lasted just long enough to tell me he hadn't expected me to pick up. When he finally spoke, his voice sounded nothing like the cold, polished certainty I had grown up fearing. It was ragged. Panicked. "Abigail." Not Abby. Not that clipped, dismissive tone he used whenever he wanted to remind me I'd disappointed him. My full name. Like he suddenly remembered I was a person. "What is it, Dad?" There was a sharp breath. Then he blurted, "The bank's taking the house." I said nothing. Behind him, I could hear my mother crying. Cabinet doors opening and closing. The low murmur of the television. Then his voice sharpened into accusation. "What did you do?" For a moment, I didn't understand what he meant. Then memory clicked into place. 7 years earlier, right before my second deployment overseas, my parents had asked me to help them refinance. Dad had framed it as temporary, a smart financial adjustment while interest rates were favorable. "Just co-sign," he'd said. "It'll help secure approval. You've got stable military income." I had signed without hesitation. Because he was my father. Because family was supposed to mean trust. What I hadn't known, what I had never thought to check, was that after the refinance, he had quietly tied the mortgage autopay to the emergency account he had access to. My account. The account he had emptied the day he threw me out. The realization settled slowly. Heavy. Clean. The money that had kept their house afloat had been mine all along. And when he drained it to protect family assets, he'd severed his own lifeline. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the motel wall. On the other end, my father was breathing hard. "Well," he snapped. For most of my life, that tone would have sent adrenaline through me, the reflexive need to explain, obey, fix whatever he believed I had broken. But something inside me had shifted on that porch in Maryland. Some old chain had finally snapped. I smiled. Not cruelly. Not triumphantly. Just with the quiet recognition of truth finally arriving exactly where it belonged. Then I ended the call. No speech. No accusation. No explanation. Just silence. The phone buzzed again immediately. I muted it and set it face down. Outside, the Virginia sky was turning gold with sunrise. For the first time in days, I felt calm. Not vindicated. Not healed. Just clear. Some lessons don't need to be taught with anger. Reality usually handles that part just fine. I showered, dressed, and walked across the motel parking lot to the little diner next door. The waitress, a woman in her 60s named Sharon, had started recognizing me by then. She poured coffee before I even sat down. "Rough week." I gave a tired smile. "You could say that." She nodded like she understood more than she asked. That's something I've always admired about older Americans. The best of them know when kindness matters more than curiosity. I was halfway through my eggs when the television above the counter switched from local weather to national news. The headline froze me in place. Pentagon procurement fraud investigation expands. The anchor's voice sharpened. Sources inside the Department of Defense now confirm widening inquiries into financial irregularities tied to Redstone Federal Logistics and affiliated contractors. My pulse kicked. Sharon noticed. "You okay, honey?" I didn't answer. On-screen file footage rolled of Redstone executives entering a federal building. Then my own photograph appeared. My official army portrait. The diner went very still. The anchor continued. Earlier reports suggested Major Abigail Reeves was under investigation for unauthorized system access. New information indicates Reeves may instead be central to uncovering the fraud itself. The room blurred for a second. I gripped the edge of the booth. The anchor kept speaking. Military investigators are now examining evidence that Major Reeves's credentials were duplicated by senior systems administrators linked to contractor oversight offices. A man at the counter turned and stared at me. Recognition dawned. I stood slowly. Then my phone exploded with notifications. Texts. Voicemails. News alerts. 27 missed calls. Most from numbers I knew. Former colleagues. Reporters. And my parents. The phone rang again. Dad. I let it ring. Again. Again. Then voicemail. I listened. His voice had changed. Gone was the accusation. Gone was the command. Now there was something almost unrecognizable. Fear and shame. Abby, he said quietly, please call us back. We didn't know. I stared at the message long after it ended. Then Colonel Mercer called. His voice was steady. They've arrested 2 oversight officials and frozen Redstone assets. I closed my eyes. It's over. Not quite. A pause. Then warmth entered his tone. But your name's been cleared, Major, officially. For a moment I couldn't breathe. 21 years of service. A lifetime spent proving myself. And now in one sentence my honor had been returned. I thought I'd feel triumph. Instead I felt grief. For the child who had spent decades chasing her father's approval. For the woman standing on that porch while her family turned her away. For all the years I had mistaken endurance for love. Mercer spoke again. You all right? I looked out the diner window at the brightening Virginia morning. And for the first time in my life I answered honestly. Yes. I think I finally am. By noon, every major news network in the country had my face on their screens. It was a strange thing watching your own army portrait appear beneath a chyron that read, Decorated Officer Cleared in Pentagon Fraud Case. I sat in the same diner booth where an hour earlier I had been a disgraced major hiding in plain sight. Now Sharon kept refilling my coffee while pretending not to stare. The regulars at the counter stole glances in my direction, their expressions shifting from curiosity to recognition to something like respect. I wasn't used to public attention. Military intelligence is built on invisibility. If people know your name, something has usually gone wrong. And for one long week, everything had. Now the truth was surfacing faster than anyone expected. The television anchor explained how investigators had uncovered an internal network of procurement fraud stretching through multiple oversight offices. Redstone Federal Logistics had funneled federal money through shell contractors for years. When I flagged irregularities in their overseas payment structures, 2 senior civilian administrators intercepted my audit requests. Then they cloned my credentials, falsified access logs, and used my profile as a scapegoat. The whole operation had nearly worked. Nearly. But one of the men they trusted, a systems analyst named Victor Salinas, had panicked after seeing how far they intended to push the cover-up. He had turned state's evidence before dawn. His testimony had broken everything open. By 11:30 that morning, federal agents had made arrests in Arlington and Washington. By noon, my suspension was formally lifted. At 12:14, my commanding general called personally. Lieutenant General Howard Whitaker was not a man known for softness. He had spent 37 years becoming exactly the kind of officer history books remember. His voice came through measured and precise. Major Reeves. Sir. A pause. Then, you have my apology. The words landed harder than I expected. I appreciate that, sir. No, he said quietly, you deserved better. I stared at the motel wallpaper while emotion tightened my throat. That was the thing about real leadership. It doesn't hide behind rank when it's wrong. Whitaker continued. You'll report to Fort Belvoir at 800 tomorrow in full dress uniform. There will be a formal reinstatement and commendation. Yes, sir. Another pause. Then his tone softened. Well done, Major. The line clicked dead. For several moments I simply sat there holding the phone. 21 years of service had taught me that praise from men like Whitaker was rare and carefully earned. But all I felt was tired. Deep down tired. The kind that settles into your bones after surviving something your mind still hasn't caught up to. The next call came 3 minutes later. "Mom." I let it ring. Then voicemail. Her voice was shaking. "Abby, sweetheart, please call us. We were wrong. We didn't understand." A sob interrupted her. Then the message ended. I closed my eyes. The old ache rose instantly. That familiar pull to comfort her. To smooth over pain. To become the capable daughter who fixed everyone else's mistakes. But another voice quieter and stronger rose beside it. You do not owe people immediate access just because they suddenly regret hurting you. That truth felt foreign. Almost rebellious. And yet it steadied me. The calls continued all afternoon. Dad. Mom. Dad again. A text. "Please, we need to talk." Another. "The foreclosure notice was a mistake. There's more going on. Please call." I ignored them all. At 5 that evening, Colonel Mercer arrived at the motel. He wore jeans and a navy polo shirt, but somehow still looked like he was conducting command inspection. He handed me a garment bag. Inside was my dress blues. Pressed perfectly. Every ribbon aligned. Every insignia polished. I looked up. "You had these cleaned," he shrugged. "Thought you might need them." That nearly broke me. Not because of the uniform. Because he had noticed what I needed before I asked. That kind of quiet care still catches me off guard. Mercer sat across from me. "You heard from your parents?" I nodded. "And, I don't know." He was silent for a while. Then he said something I've carried with me ever since. "Abigail, forgiveness and access are not the same thing." I looked at him. He folded his hands. "You can forgive someone someday and still refuse to let them keep hurting you today." The words settled somewhere deep. I thought about my father standing on that porch. About my mother looking away. About 20 years of trying to become enough for people who only measured worth by usefulness. And for the first time I considered a possibility I had never allowed myself before. Maybe I didn't need their approval to belong to myself. That night alone in the motel room, I carefully hung my uniform on the closet door. The dark blue fabric caught the yellow lamplight. Brass buttons gleamed. Rows of ribbons marked 2 decades of service sacrifice and endurance. For years I had worn that uniform hoping my father might one day see it and understand my worth. Now I understood something better. Its value had never depended on his recognition. At 7:42 the phone rang again. "Dad." This time I answered. He inhaled sharply. "Abigail." His voice sounded smaller than I had ever heard it. I said nothing. Then he spoke the words I never thought Frank Reeves would say. I was wrong. Silence stretched between us. Then quietly, "I should have trusted my daughter." Something inside me shifted. Not healed. Not whole. But softened. And for the first time since this began, I wondered if shame had finally reached him the way fear never could. I didn't forgive him that night. But I listened. And sometimes listening is the first crack where grace begins to enter. The next morning I stood in front of the motel mirror and buttoned my dress blues, one careful fastening at a time. The motions were automatic. Precise. Familiar. For 21 years this uniform had marked every turning point of my adult life. Promotions. Deployments. Funerals. Homecomings. Victories no civilian would ever hear about. And now somehow it marked this too. Reclamation. I adjusted the ribbons across my chest and looked at my reflection. The woman staring back looked older than she had 2 weeks earlier. Not physically. Something deeper. As though betrayal had burned away the last traces of someone who still believed love could be earned through performance. Outside, Virginia's early sunlight spilled across the motel parking lot. Colonel Mercer was waiting beside his truck, coffee in hand. He looked me over and gave one sharp nod. "About time the Army remembered who you are." That made me smile. The drive to Fort Belvoir was quiet. Mercer understood the value of silence. Older soldiers know that some moments deserve room to settle. When we reached post, military police waved us through the gate with formal salutes. A week earlier, another set of MPS had stripped my authority at my apartment door. Now those same gates opened to welcome me back. Life has a way of restoring balance when truth finally catches up. The ceremony was held in the command auditorium. Nothing extravagant. 100 seats. Flags arranged at the front. Rows of officers and civilian staff already seated when I entered. The room rose as one. For a moment I stopped walking. I hadn't expected that. General Whitaker stood near the podium. He met my eyes and gave the slightest nod. It wasn't ceremony. It was respect. I moved forward and took my place. The general's remarks were brief and direct. He spoke about duty, integrity, the cost of institutional failure when good people are doubted too quickly. Then he turned toward me. Major Abigail Reeves acted exactly as an officer should. Her vigilance exposed one of the most serious procurement fraud operations this command has seen in decades. His voice sharpened. We failed her before verifying the truth. That failure will not happen again. The room was utterly still. Then he pinned the Legion of Merit medal to my jacket. As his hand withdrew, he said quietly enough that only I could hear, "You honored the uniform better than we honored you." Emotion rose so suddenly I nearly lost my composure. But Army discipline held. I saluted. He returned it. The applause that followed was long and steady. And all I could think was this. My father had spent 40 years teaching me that approval had to be earned through perfection. Yet here among people who had every reason to judge harshly acknowledgement had arrived not because I was flawless, but because I had endured truthfully. After the ceremony, officers approached one by one. Some apologized. Some simply shook my hand. Others said nothing at all, their expressions carrying more sincerity than words ever could. Then I saw my phone. 32 missed calls. 20 from my parents. One voicemail had arrived during the ceremony. I stepped into an empty hallway and played it. Dad's voice came through rough and uneven. "Abigail, the sheriff posted final foreclosure papers this morning." A shaky breath followed. "We have 48 hours. Silence." Then, "I know I don't deserve to ask this, but your mother's terrified." His voice cracked. And suddenly, impossibly, I heard not the commanding father of my childhood, but an aging man confronting consequences he no longer knew how to control. He continued, "I was wrong about everything." A pause. Then the sentence that undid me. "I was so afraid of being ashamed of you, I never noticed how proud I should have been." The voicemail ended. I stood there staring at the blank screen. For years, those were the words I had wanted. A child can survive on very little hope if she believes love is still possible. And now here they were arriving decades late and spoken through defeat. Colonel Mercer found me standing there. He read my expression immediately. "What happened?" I handed him the phone. He listened quietly. When it ended, he looked up. "What are you thinking?" I stared down the long, polished hallway of Fort Belvoir, at young officers walking briskly toward work, at the life I had fought to reclaim. Then I answered honestly, "I think I'm tired of letting pain make my decisions." Mercer said nothing. He didn't need to. By afternoon, I was driving north to Maryland. The highway stretched ahead beneath a pale autumn sky. Every mile carried memory. Family road trips. High school debates with my father. The long drive home after West Point graduation when he had said, "Not bad," like it was praise enough to last a lifetime. By the time I pulled into my parents' driveway, dusk had settled. The foreclosure notice was taped to the front door. The American flag still hung neatly from the porch. But the house itself looked smaller somehow. Fragile. Like pride had been the only thing holding it upright. I stepped out of the car. And for the first time in my life, I approached that front door with nothing left to prove. The porch light was already on when I walked up the front steps. For a second, my hand hovered over the same brass doorbell I had pressed a week earlier. That morning, I had stood here frightened, disgraced, and desperate for comfort. Tonight, I stood here restored. Not because the Army had cleared my name. Not because the uniform on my shoulders carried fresh recognition. But because somewhere between losing everything and getting it back, I had stopped measuring my worth by whether this door opened for me. I pressed the bell. Footsteps shuffled inside. Then the door opened. My father looked smaller than I remembered. Frank Reeves had always filled a room through sheer force of certainty. Even in retirement, he carried himself like a man who believed control was his birthright. That certainty was gone now. His shoulders sagged. His neatly combed gray hair looked thinner. The skin beneath his eyes had hollowed into shadows. And when he saw me standing there in full dress blues, his face folded in on itself. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then he stepped aside. "Please come in." The house smelled exactly as it had my entire childhood lemon-polish old books and my mother's lavender hand soap. The familiarity hit harder than I expected. Memory is a strange thing. It can ache even when attached to pain. Mom stood in the living room near the fireplace, twisting a handkerchief between trembling fingers. The moment she saw me, tears spilled down her cheeks. "Abby," I gave a small nod. Not cold, not warm, simply present. She crossed the room and stopped a few feet away as though uncertain she had the right to come closer. That hurt more than anger would have, because it meant she knew what she'd done. We sat in the living room where I had opened Christmas gifts as a child and studied for SAT exams under my father's stern supervision. Now silence filled every corner. Finally, Dad spoke. The bank accelerated the foreclosure after Redstone's assets were frozen. I frowned. "What does Redstone have to do with your mortgage?" His expression tightened. Then shame darkened his face. Years seemed to settle into him all at once. He looked suddenly old. 3 years ago, he said quietly, "I invested our retirement funds with a private equity group." A sick feeling stirred in my stomach. He kept going. "They promised stable returns, conservative growth. They were backed through Redstone affiliates." Of course they were. Contractor shell money laundering often flowed through respectable-looking retirement instruments. For older investors, it was a familiar trap trust, the polished men with brochures and percentages. Dad stared at his hands. "When your account became accessible, I used it to cover our mortgage while waiting for the investments to recover." I felt something inside me go still. Not rage. Not even shock. Just clarity. For years, he had quietly depended on my money while presenting himself as the provider. The man who had lectured me about responsibility had been surviving on my sacrifices while calling it family stewardship. Mom's voice broke through. I knew some of it. I looked at her. She wept openly now. I told myself he'd fix it. I told myself families help each other. But I knew it wasn't right. There it was. The truth at last. Not monsters. Not villains. Just frightened people whose pride had slowly made cowards of them. Dad looked up at me then, and his voice cracked. "I emptied your account because I panicked." He swallowed hard. "When the military investigation hit the news, I thought everything would be seized. I thought if I protected what was left." "What was left?" I asked quietly. He flinched. The question hung there. What was left after years of taking from a daughter he had never truly seen? Tears filled his eyes. The sight stunned me. Frank Reeves did not cry. Not when his own father died. Not when Mom survived breast cancer. Not when I deployed to Afghanistan. But now tears slipped down his face unchecked. And he whispered the words I never thought I would hear. I threw away my child to save a house and still lost both. The room went silent. I looked at this man who had shaped so much of my life through absence disguised as discipline. And for the first time I saw him clearly. Not as the giant whose approval I had chased. Not as the judge whose standards defined me. Just an aging man who had spent his life worshipping control until it cost him the very people he meant to protect. And suddenly I pitied him. Real pity. Not contempt. Not triumph. Mercy. I stood. Both of them looked up frightened I was leaving. Instead, I walked to the front window and looked out at the dark street where I'd once learned to ride a bicycle under my father's watchful eye. Then I turned back. I can stop the foreclosure. Neither of them moved. Dad's face drained of color. Why? It was a fair question. After everything, why? I thought about Colonel Mercer's words. Forgiveness and access are not the same thing. Then I answered. Because if I let bitterness decide who I become, then this wins twice. Mom covered her mouth and sobbed. Dad stared at me like he no longer recognized the daughter standing before him. Maybe he didn't. The frightened girl who once begged for scraps of his approval was gone. In her place stood a woman who had finally learned this. Mercy offered freely is not weakness. It is freedom. The next morning I wired enough money to halt proceedings. Not to erase the past. Not to pretend trust was restored overnight, but to make room for something better than revenge. That evening, after the paperwork cleared, Dad met me at the front door as I prepared to leave. His eyes were red. His hands shook slightly. For a moment he said nothing. Then very softly he spoke my full name. Welcome home, Abigail Reeves. Not ownership. Not expectation. Just pride. At last freely given. I smiled. And this time when he opened his arms I stepped into them. Some wounds never fully disappear. But healing begins the moment we stop asking pain to tell us who we are. If this story stirred something in your heart, if you've ever had to choose grace when anger felt easier, I hope you'll carry that reflection with you. And perhaps share it with someone who needs it. And if stories like this remind you that it's never too late for truth healing and second chances, I'd be honored if you stayed for the next one.